The 2024 NFL schedule has officially been released. Who and when are the Seahawks going to be playing their 17 opponents? Going to take a deep dive with some key takeaways with the just released schedule coming up next year on our bonus edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s out there. There's a lot of schedule-related programming out there. If you are tuning in to this live show here on Locked On Seahawks, we greatly appreciate it, whether you're tuning in nearby Bellevue, Washington, or if you are down in San Antonio, Texas. We appreciate all of you. And the schedule is officially out. Everybody's been leaking the games for the Seahawks all day long. There's been some that have proven to be inaccurate, but the good news is with some extra vetting throughout the day, we had the schedule pegged out as early as 2 o'clock this afternoon. So without further ado, let's look at that schedule, who the Seahawks are going to be playing and when. The 2024 schedule here, I'm going to dive into these teams more specifically here in a moment, but Seattle opens with the Denver Broncos at home, then a road game with the New England Patriots, home against the Dolphins, Monday Night Football on the road in Week 4 against the Detroit Lions, New York Giants, and San Francisco 49ers back-to-back weeks at Lumen Field, the game against San Francisco being a Thursday night game. Falcons on the road in Week 7, and then closing out that first half of the season, home games against the Bills and the Rams. So there is a 5-game stretch there where the Seahawks are going to have 4 games at Lumen Field. Then they have their Week 10 bye right before their rematch with the 49ers in San Francisco. A bunch of road games to close out the season. The Cardinals at home in Week 12, then on the road against the Jets and the Cardinals back-to-back weeks. Home games, Packers and Vikings in Week 15 and Week 16, and the Chicago Bears and Rams being road games to close out the season. The Bears game being a Thursday night football matchup the day after Christmas. So you look at this schedule for the Seattle Seahawks, a lot of this stuff was already reported either yesterday or early this morning. Many of these leaks proved to be accurate. There were a few earlier today that kind of made me scoff a little bit. I had to go back and look at some other leaks from reputable sources, and it became clear that some of the games were not correct. And luckily, again, that schedule there, we had that at 2 o'clock this afternoon. So without further ado, let's take a little bit closer look at the way this schedule sets up for the Seattle Seahawks. And again, the first 5 weeks here, weeks 1 through 5, starting with the home game against the Denver Broncos, there's not going to be the same hype for this matchup that there was 2 years ago when Russell Wilson was making his much anticipated return to Lumen Field. But still, this is a Broncos team that may be breaking in a rookie quarterback in Bo Nix. Maybe it'll be Jarrett Stidham for the season opener. That's something that we're going to have to wait and see on. But Denver is a younger team that's trying to rebuild. They're trying to reload quickly. So that's the home opener, the season opener in Week 1. Then the long trip to Foxborough. This will be one of the few games that is a 10 a.m. Pacific time start. Those are always tricky. We'll see how Mike Macdonald navigates that because Pete Carroll's teams were excellent on those early starts. And I think this is really exciting for the Seahawks when you consider the best teams in their schedule the first half of the year. It seems like the vast majority of them are home games. The Miami Dolphins in Week 3, instead of having to fly down to Miami, the furthest trip the Seahawks can make, at least in the mainland. If they were going to London or something, that's different. But they don't have to make that trip. The Dolphins have to make it flying out to Seattle. So they're going to be at home against a really good Dolphins team. And then they get their Monday night matchup in Detroit, one of the few places on the road that the Seahawks have really liked to play recently. Geno Smith has played some of his best football in back-to-back wins over the Lions. That is sure to be a dandy on Monday Night Football at Ford Field. And then potentially a matchup between Geno Smith and Drew Lock when the Giants come to town in Week 5. I would not rule out the possibility that Drew Lock is the starting quarterback for the New York Giants, even though Daniel Jones is working his way back from a torn ACL, and it sounds like he will be ready for training camp. That is still a quarterback competition that I'm expecting going to happen that the team has not been giving much credence to. But there's a possibility we could see Drew Lock against his former starter in front of him, Geno Smith. So that would create some intrigue for a matchup that otherwise isn't one of the more fascinating ones on the Seahawks schedule. You go to the next section, the next 5 games on the Seattle Seahawks schedule here. Coming up off of that game against Detroit, the home matchup against the San Francisco 49ers, week 6, Thursday night football. That has not been a good situation for the Seahawks playing at home in primetime against the 49ers the last couple of years. They've gotten shellacked both times. They'll be hoping to change that narrative and get back to winning some home games in what once was a one-sided rivalry in Seattle's favor. Then on the road at Atlanta, the only road game the Seahawks have from week 5 to week 9. They get the Buffalo Bills at home. Again, another team that's been to the playoffs several years in a row that has been close to making it to the Super Bowl. They've had some major losses this offseason, but still, they've got Josh Allen getting the Bills at home. That is a significant advantage for the Seahawks. And then their first matchup against the Rams, that one's going to be at home before they have their week 10 bye, which certainly is a much better situation than last year when the Seahawks had a bye in week 5. Then they had to play 12 consecutive regular season games to close out the year. They had back-to-back Thursday night games in there. Seattle does have 2 Thursday night games this year, but they are not back-to-back this time, and they have a much later bye. So that is typically what teams want. They want to have that later bye week so that they can get a rest later in the season. The Seahawks are going to get that this year with week 10 having that bye. And then looking at our next set of games for the Seahawks, another matchup with the 49ers coming out of the bye. That's always good news when you get to play your bitter rivals after the bye week. They'll be rested up before they head to Santa Clara. And then 2 games against the Cardinals in a 3-week span. This is not unusual. We saw this with the 49ers a few years back. In fact, the Cardinals had a similar situation with the Seahawks several years ago. So this is not uncommon to have 2 divisional games in a 3-week span. So they'll play the Cardinals twice, and that's sandwiched around a game that could be one of the tougher road games on Seattle's schedule with a healthy Aaron Rodgers and a lot of talent on that defense for the New York Jets traveling cross-country to East Rutherford, New Jersey. That has a chance to be one of the Seahawks' tougher games. And then closing out the season, wrapping things up for the Seahawks, week 15 to 18, the home games against Green Bay and Minnesota. Those will be the last 2 guaranteed home games for the Seahawks in the 2024 season. 2 teams in much different positions. Green Bay, I've talked about it in this show. I think that the Packers are a sleeper Super Bowl team in the NFC. And there's a lot of people, a lot of listeners that were scoffing at that notion. But if you watch that team the end of last year, the way they rallied, they were able to win a playoff game in Dallas, advance to the divisional round. Jordan Love improved a great deal, a bunch as the season progressed. They've added some really intriguing pieces in free agency and the draft. Minnesota, I would suspect J.J. McCarthy is going to be starting by that stage of the season if he doesn't start right out of the gate. If Sam Darnold's still in the lineup, then obviously that is not going to be an elite quarterback that's going to be quarterbacking for Minnesota, but still the Vikings have a lot of talent on both sides of the football, so that's not going to be a gimme either. And then those last 2 games, the Chicago Bears, Thursday night football on December 26th at Soldier Field. That is the worst time to draw the Chicago Bears on the road because anybody that's lived in the Midwest, I'm from Indiana, you realize quickly that you want to avoid having to play outdoors in Chicago on December 26th. Maybe Seattle will get lucky and the weather will be mild, but there's always the chance that there could be 40-mile-an-hour winds, snowballs hitting you in the helmet. So that is always a risky time to have a road game, even in prime time. So that's a challenge. And, of course, the Rams coming off a playoff appearance a year ago had a really good draft, in my opinion, too. That's a team that's going to be right in the thick of things in the NFC West as well. So you get them in week 18 in a game that could be a de facto playoff game for both the Seahawks and the Rams. So that really tells you all you need to know about the next segment. That's going to be one of the key takeaways, the differences between the first half of the schedule, the second half of the schedule, and the way things shook out for the Seahawks. But I'm going to be getting to those key takeaways here coming up next on our bonus edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by our friends at FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. If you think Nate McKinnon has a hat trick coming up for the Avalanche against the Stars tonight, or George Kirby's going to strike out 10 or more for the Mariners on his next start, or maybe you're thinking that Darius Garland's going to drop 20 or more points for the Cavaliers against the Celtics in Game 5 of their series, you can bet on all of those on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. You're listening to the bonus schedule reveal edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in for this impromptu bonus episode. The NFL just now unleashing the official schedules for all 32 teams. We have known the Seahawks schedule, most of it since early this afternoon, had it all penciled out and then put in pen by 2 o'clock. And it turns out that all of those leaks ended up coming true. Looking at the schedule again, real quick for the Seahawks, a bunch of home games early, including week 1 Denver Broncos. 4 home games in a 5-game span from week 5 to week 9. That includes a Thursday night matchup with the 49ers at Lumen Field. And in the second half of the season, week 10, there's a later bye week this year. Seahawks will certainly be appreciating that. And then they've got a bunch of road games, including 3 road games against NFC West opponents in the last 8 games. So looking at this schedule for the Seattle Seahawks, as far as takeaways for me, I mentioned this on social media. The one thing you're not going to hear me, I'll mention the words right now, but I'm not going to dive into it. There will be no discussion on strength of schedule because I think it is the most ridiculous metric out there. It's based off of last year's win-losses for teams, and every team is getting at least a 20-25% roster shakeup from one year to the next. So those ratings, those percentages have very little bearing, if any, on what's going to happen in the upcoming season. So I'm not going to be looking at strength of schedule. But the first thing that jumps out, and I've kind of hinted at it a little bit already, when you look at that first half of the season, there's no such thing as an easy win in the National Football League. But the Seahawks have been gifted a really good situation to get off to a fast start in the first year under coach Mike Macdonald. When you look at the matchups that they are going to be playing at home in the first 9 weeks, 6 of those games are at home, starting with Denver. I mentioned this earlier. The Miami Dolphins, that is a team that I would look out for in the AFC that could be in the mix to get to the Super Bowl. They have not been able to get over the hump and win playoff games, but they've had some injuries at untimely situations the last couple years. Last year, Tyreek Hill. The year before, they had a backup quarterback playing. If they are able to keep their key players healthy, Miami is going to be one of the better teams in the AFC. So getting them early in the year at home, that is a big positive for the Seahawks. And then having that Thursday night game against San Francisco fairly early in the year, not on Thanksgiving, thank goodness. These guys can enjoy their time with their families. Reporters can enjoy time with their families. And getting Buffalo and the Rams at home as well during this stretch, that really bodes well for the Seattle Seahawks when you have 6 home games in your first 9. It's a real opportunity to hit the ground running. And I think when you just look at the schedule in general, starting off with Denver and New England, again, there's no such thing as an easy win in the NFL, but those are 2 teams that I suspect there's a chance they could be in the running for top 5 picks next year. And so for the Seattle Seahawks to have both those teams on their schedule out of the gate, good opportunity to get to 2-0 before taking on Miami and Detroit in back-to-back games. Those are difficult games, but at least one of them is at home. Then you get the 49ers, that first matchup Thursday Night Football. That game is at your own place for the 12s to cheer on as well. It feels like this first 9-game stretch is a really favorable one for the Seahawks, not just with the fact there's several teams in there that they should be favored over, but the teams that are really good teams on their schedule, the majority of them, those are going to be home games. The flip side of this is after the bye week, and I guess you can look at that as a silver lining. At least the Seahawks get their bye week in week 10 before they go into the gauntlet that is the last 8 games that they have on the schedule this year. The toughest stretch to me starts in week 13. And some of you may argue, well, the 49ers are week 11. Yes, that's going to be a really difficult game. But week 13 is the one I'm highlighting. The home game against the Cardinals. Arizona always gives Seattle a battle. It's an NFC West rivalry. So you could even start this in week 12. But the game against Aaron Rodgers and the Jets in week 13. That is going to be an early start. Now, this is late enough in the season. It could get flexed. If the Seahawks and Jets are both in playoff contention, it could be a flex candidate to move into the Sunday night spot. But for now, we're going to assume that this is a 10 a.m. start, Seahawks and Jets, 10 a.m. Pacific time. You're playing against Aaron Rodgers, who is going to have a chip on his shoulder this year after missing all but 4 snaps last year. The Jets have a lot of talent. That is a team that's desperate to get back to the playoffs. It's been a long time. Then you got to play Arizona on the road. I think Arizona, I don't want to say they're a playoff team, but I think they're going to be frisky. This is a team that had a really good draft, and Seattle's had their issues playing at that house of horrors down in Glendale at State Farm Stadium. And then from there, you got to play Green Bay, a team that I'm very high on going into this season. Minnesota and Chicago are going to be breaking in rookie quarterbacks. Minnesota, it feels like that's probably the easiest game here, and there's still some really good players on the team. If J.J. McCarthy flourishes early, then Minnesota could be a surprise team. But then you look at those last 2 games. Again, the weather with the Chicago Bears. Caleb Williams, number 1 overall pick. This team won 7 games last year, so they were on the cusp of being in the wild card hunt. If Caleb Williams lives up to the number 1 overall pick hype with Rome Odunze joining the team as his new number 1 receiver, they already have DJ Moore. This team has a lot of pieces. Chicago could very much be in the playoff hunt at that stage in week 17, as the Seahawks are hoping to be, and you're playing on the road in what could be hostile weather at Soldier Field. And then the Rams in week 18. You always are going to play a division rival. It's the way that the NFL has set up the schedule, but playing the Rams on the road in the last game, you could be looking at, if it's been like the last 2 seasons, that could be the game that decides whether the Seahawks are in the playoffs or not. And having to play against a Rams team that's got a lot of really good veterans, they got some good young players they've brought in, had a good draft. They're well coached by Sean McVay. That is, to me, the toughest stretch, and it's really the tail end of the season. So going back to those early games, that early stretch for the Seahawks with 6 home games and 9, if you can get to 6-3 or even 7-2 during that stretch, that might be key, because I think going 4-4 in those last 8 games, that might be viewed as a positive result. If you can get to 4-4 because you've got 5 road games, 3 of them against division rivals. I can't say that I can remember the last time that Seahawks had 3 road games against NFC West opponents all in the last 8 games in the second half of the season. I can't remember that happening. I'm sure it's happened before, but that is not what you're hoping for. You're hoping that those are spread out some, and instead, Seahawks are going to be playing a couple of their home games in the NFC West early in the season. Then they get all 3 of their road games in division late in the season. So maybe not the draw the Seahawks were hoping for from that standpoint, but it puts more stress on the early part of the year. Can you take advantage of all those home games that you've got? Some very winnable games on the docket there. The fact that in the two primetime games, you're playing in Detroit where you've had some success before, and you're playing the 49ers at home. Can you get your mojo back at Lumen Field and find a way to keep that game close or pull off the upset over the 49ers? It just feels like this is a schedule early that's catered for the Seahawks to have some success if they're able to get hot out of the gate. Second half, those games are going to be critical. I don't think it's as bad as last year when Seattle had 2 games against San Francisco, a game against Dallas, and a game against Philadelphia in 4 consecutive weeks. I don't think it's that level of stress, but it's still a very difficult second part of the schedule, especially with 5 road games and then the final 8 and the last 2 games being away from Lumen Field. That's going to be something that's going to be tricky. One last thing that really jumped out to me here that is kind of in the middle of this. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, just because there's some uncertainty. And it has to do with the fact that when you look at the Seahawks schedule, they've got the possibility to see 4 rookie quarterbacks this year. I'd be really surprised if Michael Penix Jr., the former Washington star, is playing for the Falcons when Seattle travels to Atlanta in week 7. If Kirk Cousins gets hurt again, of course, that's a possibility. But I suspect Kirk Cousins, he is the guy. They paid him a bunch of money. He's going to be the starter. But you look at the other 4 teams here. Denver in week 1. I think there's a very good chance that Bo Nix, the former Oregon star, picked 12th overall. I think there's a very good chance that he beats out Jarrett Stidham and he is the starter for the Broncos in week 1. Seattle could be playing against Nix in his NFL regular season debut. The week after that, New England, little different situation. Jacoby Brissett coming back to the Patriots, a solid veteran. And I don't feel like Drake May is as pro ready because he's only started 2 years in North Carolina. Maybe he surprises. I'm not going to rule out that May could be starting in that game for New England, who's looking towards the future. But I'm suspecting at this point, especially that early in the year, that it's going to be Jacoby Brissett. And then you look at the two other teams that could play rookie QBs late in the schedule. I mentioned this earlier. When you're playing the Vikings in week 16, I just don't anticipate Sam Darnold is going to be the starter at that stage. I think J.J. McCarthy will take over at some point in the first half of the season for Minnesota, unless Sam Darnold comes in and has a Geno Smith type resurrection of his career. And, maybe that ends up happening, but I expect J.J. McCarthy is going to be starting at some point early in the season. So he will be the starter by week 16. And depending how he's been playing, that may be a bad thing for the Seahawks because Sam Darnold, a journeyman that's bounced around with a bunch of teams, that might be the QB you want to go against instead of a high upside first-round pick and a guy that's won a lot of games at every level he's been at in J.J. McCarthy. And then the week after, the Chicago Bears, a team that won 7 games last year. Justin Fields didn't do enough to retain him, so they traded him to the Pittsburgh Steelers. It is now the Caleb Williams show. They've already declared him the starter before he even took a mini camp snap. I don't know if I agree with that tactic, but your pick number 1, you're expected to be the starter, has all the talent in the world. How he adapts to the NFL game and how he adapts with his improvisation skills and from the pocket, those are things that are going to be worth watching. But he's an exciting player. Chicago's got a lot of really good players on both sides of the ball to go around him. That's a team that looks to be on the cusp of getting somewhere as a playoff contender, and playing them in Chicago in December, that's got a chance to be a messy situation for the Seahawks. And so this is one of those weird things. Early on, it feels like, hey, if you're playing New England with a raw Drake May, or you're playing Bo Nix in week 1 with Denver, a team that's got a lot of holes still in that roster, Seattle's probably thinking we'd rather have the rookie out there at the beginning of the season. Late in the year, you're wondering, hey, Sam Darnold, can you keep the seat warm but not let J.J. McCarthy take the job yet for the Vikings? And then Caleb Williams obviously is going to be the guy late in the year. So I feel like that's kind of a to-be-determined situation, how much that impacts things. Normally, you like playing against rookie quarterbacks because of inexperience, not knowing the NFL game as well. At the same time, though, some of those teams, they have journeyman veterans set to compete against those guys. And some of these teams already named the rookie to quarterback, starting quarterback already. So that's going to be something that bears watching. The good news, you get 4 primetime games, maybe more than that late in the year. If you have a game flex and the Seahawks are in the hunt, and you don't have a lot of 10 a.m. starts, especially because Detroit and Chicago both are night games, you don't have to worry about that either. So those things are working in the Seahawks' favor here. Overall, I feel like this is a better, a more forgiving schedule that we saw this time last year. But again, we don't know how all these teams are going to perform. We don't know what injuries are going to happen. There's still a lot of unknowns out there, but not having the bye early in the season, not having back-to-back Thursday night games, only having a couple of 10 a.m. starts, those are all positives, and getting that 6 home game in 9 games stretch to open the season, that could be a godsend for a team that's adjusting to a new coach and new schemes. So we'll see what happens. Coming up on tomorrow's show, we are going to be taking a look at the schedule, and we're going to be making predictions, way too early predictions on how the season is going to unfold for the Seahawks. Week 1 all the way to week 18. Make sure that you're listening in. Thanks for tuning in to this bonus episode. Go Hawks.